That morning in Phoenix was unremarkable. No rain, no strong wind, only the familiar dry Arizona sun was beating down on the dust-covered parking lot in front of Hayes Automotive. Inside the garage, the sounds of metal striking metal rang out in a steady rhythm. Air guns, compressors, engines growling softly before falling silent again. Everything unfolded like hundreds of mornings before. Daniel Miller stood bent over the engine bay of a late-model SUV. His work coveralls were faded from oil and grease, his hands blackened with engine grime. His movements were slow, precise, and economical. No one paid much attention to him because Dan had always been that kind of person. Present, working, silent. He was 41 years old, an ordinary auto mechanic. At least, that was what everyone in the shop believed. Dan leaned closer to the engine bay and closed his eyes for a few seconds. He listened. Not looked. Not measured. Just listened. Then he adjusted a pressure valve using an old method, a diagnostic approach he had learned long ago in a very different place, in a different life. At that moment, the sharp click of high heels echoed across the concrete floor. Rebecca Hayes walked into the garage. She was 34 years old, CEO of Hayes Automotive Group, a familiar name in the regional business world. A perfectly tailored gray suit, hair pulled into a neat bun, eyes cold and sharp like a scalpel. Rebecca was not there to greet anyone. She was there to inspect. She moved down the shop floor with a tablet in hand, stopping at each workstation to take notes and observe. No detail escaped her. To Rebecca, the slightest mistake could become evidence of incompetence, and she did not allow incompetence to exist in her company. When her gaze settled on Dan, everything slowed. Rebecca frowned. "What are you doing?" Her voice cut through the mechanical noise. Dan looked up. His eyes were tired but calm. "Checking the transmission chamber pressure, ma'am." Rebecca glanced at her tablet, then back at his hands. "This method isn't in the company's procedures." Dan wiped his hands on a cloth. "That's true, but it's more accurate in certain cases." "No." Rebecca cut him off. Her voice was cold and final. The entire garage fell silent. "This isn't the military. This is a company, and here we follow procedures." She looked straight at Dan. "You're fired. Effective immediately." No whispers, no objections. Dan stood still, his hands clenched unconsciously. A very brief moment, as if he were weighing something. Then his shoulders dropped. "Ma'am," his voice was low, nearly swallowed by the air. "I still have the afternoon shift. I need the money. My daughter needs her medication." Rebecca did not respond. She turned and walked away without looking back. To her, the decision had been made, and once made, a decision required no explanation. Dan removed his gloves and placed them on the table. He walked out of the garage in silence. No one saw him off. No one called his name. Only the harsh sunlight in the parking lot and the hollow pressure tightening in his chest. The feeling of a man who had just lost the only job keeping his child alive. Dan had just stepped through the gate when the ground began to tremble. A deep, heavy sound, terrifyingly familiar, tore through the still air. The thrum of helicopter blades. He stopped. Instinct surged faster than thought. From a distance, a gray military helicopter descended, its rotor wash whipping dust and loose paper across the parking lot. Dan narrowed his eyes. He knew that sound. And deep inside, he knew the life he had tried to bury for years had just found. Daniel Miller's apartment was on the second floor of an old apartment complex in West Phoenix. The wall paint was peeling at the corners. The stair railing was slightly loose. Nothing about the apartment suggested stability. except for one thing: Lily's laughter. Dan opened the door, and as soon as he stepped inside, he heard his daughter calling out from the dining table. "Dad, I finished my homework!" Lily, 9 years old, her brown hair tied up in a high ponytail, sat swinging her legs on an old wooden chair. Beside her were a math notebook, a pencil worn down at the tip, and an inhaler placed neatly by her right hand. Always there, always within reach. Dan smiled. A tired smile, but a real one. "Good job." He set his empty lunchbox in the sink and leaned down to kiss her forehead. Lily looked at her father's oil-stained work coveralls and wrinkled her nose in disapproval. "Dad, did you fix cars all day again today?" Dan nodded. "Yeah. Every car needs someone who listens to it." Lily tilted her head. "Cars can talk?" Dan chuckled softly. "If you listen long enough, everything talks." Lily laughed with him, but a light cough cut it short. She quickly reached for her inhaler. Dan stayed still, saying nothing, watching every breath she took. Only when Lily's breathing evened out did he exhale, almost as if he himself had just come through a bout of oxygen deprivation. Dinner that night was as simple as it could be: macaroni and cheese, fried sausages, a cheap meal repeated many times during the week. But Lily ate happily. "Dad," she said midway through the meal, "when I grow up, I'll buy you a really big garage." Dan laughed. "Oh yeah?" "Yeah. You won't have to work so many shifts anymore." Lily looked up at him, serious, in an innocent way. "I don't like it when you're tired." The words left Dan silent for a moment. He turned away, pretending to clear the dishes. Night fell quickly in Phoenix. Outside, the world was tranquil. Dan sat at the kitchen table facing a neatly stacked pile of bills: rent, electricity, Lily's medication. The last number was always the largest. He took out his wallet, counted the money, then counted again, as if hoping the bills might multiply if he were patient enough. It wasn't enough. Dan sighed. Not the sigh of a desperate man, but of someone long accustomed to having to keep going, even without knowing how. In the corner of the living room, his toolbox sat against the wall. Military green, scratched, worn. A few markings had faded with time. Dan stood up and opened the lid. Inside, among the repair tools, was a small, round metal object, a commemorative coin. Dan picked it up, turning it slowly in his hand. The engraved eagle reflected the weak yellow light. He stared at it for a long time, then set it down, face turned inward. He didn't want Lily to see it. At the repair shop, people used to joke that Dan could hear an engine like a heartbeat. Once he had stood a few steps away from a car, tilted his head, and said, "The problem is in the third valve." And he was always right. They didn't know why. They didn't ask. Dan had never told anyone why he could detect the slightest differences in the sounds of metal. Why did his hands always go to the correct spot on the first try? Why were his reflexes faster than necessary? Those weren't skills learned in a garage. They were forged in sleepless nights, in strong winds at high altitude, in flights where a single small mistake would end everything. Dan closed the toolbox. He turned toward the bedroom and looked at Lily sleeping soundly, her chest rising and falling steadily. The inhaler rested by the head of the bed. Dan stood there for a long time. If anyone asked him who he was, Dan would answer simply, "A father." But deep down he knew, to protect that simple truth, he had once had to become someone entirely different. The following morning, Hayes Automotive returned to its familiar rhythm. Engines starting, metal clashing, the smell of oil mixed with heat rising from the concrete floor. Only one thing was different. Daniel Miller's workstation was empty. The military green toolbox that used to sit by the table leg was gone. The cloth rag that always hung in the corner was gone. The quiet, middle-aged man who always arrived early and left last was gone. A few younger mechanics noticed. They glanced at the space, then quickly turned back to their work. In a place where everyone was busy protecting their own position, the absence of someone else rarely lasted more than a few seconds in anyone's thoughts. "Heard he got fired," a voice spoke near the break area. "Really? Just for not following the procedure?" "Yeah, new CEO. She doesn't mess around." A few soft laughs followed, not cruel, but careless. To them, it was just a side story, a reminder not to step outside the lines. Only Frank, the oldest mechanic in the shop, did not laugh. Frank was 61 years old, 30 years spent with machines, and 10 years before that, with the military. He leaned against a workbench, eyes fixed on the corner of the garage where Dan used to work. Frank remembered the first time he had taken notice of Dan clearly. That day, a pickup truck had been towed in with a strange noise. 3 young mechanics had spent nearly an hour checking it without finding the cause. Dan walked past, stopped, and tilted his head. "Camshaft is off by a half a beat." He said it very quietly, almost to himself. 10 minutes later, they opened it up to check. Dan was right. Not luck, not a guess. Frank had heard that kind of certainty before in people who were used to having no margin for error. He walked over to Dan's locker. The door was still unlocked. Dan must have left in a hurry. Inside, besides a jacket and a hard hat, there was a small photograph taped to the inside of the door, an old photo, yellowed with age. Frank frowned. The photo showed a younger man with a hardened expression, wearing a gray flight suit, standing in front of a military helicopter. On his shoulder was an insignia Frank could not mistake. Navy. Frank exhaled slowly. "That can't be." He reached out and lightly touched the edge of the photo. It had been turned face down, as if its owner didn't want anyone to see it. "Did you find something?" a younger mechanic asked, curious. Frank shook his head. "Nothing." But inside, the pieces were already shifting into place. Across the city, Dan stood in line at a pharmacy. Cold fluorescent lights washed over tired faces. People stood close together, yet no one truly looked at anyone else. When it was his turn, Dan slid the prescription across the counter. The pharmacist glanced at it, typed a few keys, then looked up. "Your insurance doesn't cover the full amount. Total comes to $122. Dan nodded and took it out, his wallet. He counted the money very slowly. Not because the math was hard, but because he had already counted this amount countless times in his head. When the last bills lay on the counter, he knew the outcome before the pharmacist spoke. "You're $42 short." Dan stood still. No reaction. No pleading. Just standing there, as if trying to keep his body from collapsing. Behind him, someone sighed. A look of pity passed by. Dan nodded. "Yes, I understand." He gathered the money, put it back into his wallet, and stepped aside to make room for the next customer. In that moment, Dan did not think about the garage. He did not think about Rebecca Hayes. He did not think about the past. He thought only of Lily, of each breath she took. Outside the pharmacy, the pale blue sky stretched overhead, peaceful to the point of cruelty. Dan stepped out, the sunlight hitting his eyes, forcing him to squint. And then, a familiar sound rose from far away. Low, deep, steady. Dan froze. He had tried to forget that sound for years. But some things, once etched into the body, never leave. The sound of helicopter blades. Dan looked up, and this time, he knew for sure. The past was no longer just whispering. It was coming back, very close. The sound did not arrive loudly at first. It came from far away, low, deep, steady, like a massive heartbeat pounding through the sky. Dan stood outside the pharmacy entrance, his hands still gripping his wallet tightly. The harsh phoenix sunlight made everything in front of him seem to shimmer. For a few seconds he told himself it was just his memory playing tricks on him, just some random noise. A civilian aircraft is passing overhead. But his body reacted before his mind could intervene. His shoulders tensed, his neck tilted slightly, his eyes automatically scanned the sky, searching for something. No way. He whispered it, as if to himself. The sound grew clearer. The wind began to shift. Loose scraps of paper rolled across the parking lot. A few people looked up, raising their hands to shield their eyes. Then it appeared. A gray military helicopter, long-bodied, rotors spinning hard, descending steadily from the south. On the fuselage, a familiar insignia stood out, recognizable without needing a closer look. U.S. Navy. The parking lot suddenly erupted into chaos. Someone gasped in disbelief. Phones were pulled out. Cameras started recording. Dan did not move. He stood there in the sun-soaked lot as if nailed to the ground. In his mind, old images came flooding back, out of order, without warning. Red cockpit lights, shrill warning alarms, sweat running down his spine even as the wind outside cut with cold. The helicopter touched down less than 50 meters from him. The rotor wash was so strong that Dan had to squint. Dust and sand billowed into the air. The side door opened. A woman stepped out. She wore a Navy uniform with command insignia on her shoulders. Compact build, focused eyes. She did not look around. She did not care about the phones pointed in her direction. She looked straight at Dan. Her steps were firm and deliberate, walking toward him as if this were not a pharmacy parking lot, but a familiar military base. Dan felt his throat go dry. When she stopped in front of him, the wind from the rotors still tugged at his jacket. "Daniel Miller." Her voice was clear, not loud. Dan swallowed. "Yes." She studied him for several seconds, long enough to read the years etched into his face. Then she said the words he had spent years trying to forget. "We've been looking for you. Ghost 6. The air around them seemed to freeze. A few people glanced at one another. Someone whispered, "What did she just call him?" Another muttered, "Must be the wrong guy." Dan shook his head slightly. "You're mistaken. I'm not that person anymore." The woman did not argue right away. She stepped closer by one pace and lowered her voice, not to hide it, but as a sign of respect. "The Navy doesn't see it that way, Commander Lieutenant." Dan closed his eyes for a brief moment. That name, that rank, that life. He opened his eyes, his voice low and firm. "I walked away." "We know," she nodded. "But we need you, right now." She pulled out a tablet and tapped a few commands. The screen filled with chaotic lines, radar signals, distorted data, faint dots lost in a sea of information. "Our pilot has been missing for 48 hours. Last known coordinates were in the Gulf of Oman. No one can pinpoint the location." Dan did not intend to look, but his eyes were drawn to the screen anyway. He stepped closer instinctively. The wind whipped through his hair. The rotor noise softened. He studied the data, quickly. No verbal analysis, no further questions. "This isn't debris," he said, his voice low but certain. "This is a helicopter." The woman froze. "You're sure?" Dan pointed to a small point on the display. "Frequency deviation here, rotor obstruction, emergency landing. The pilot is alive." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "Oh my God, how did he see that? Who is he?" Dan looked up. His eyes no longer carried the exhaustion from before. In that moment, something else surfaced, calm, sharp, familiar. He turned to the woman. "If you want to save him, you need to fly now." She looked at him, then nodded decisively. Standing there amid the sun, the wind, and the stares of dozens of strangers, Dan realized an undeniable truth. He could walk away from the sky, but the sky had never walked away from him. The helicopter lifted off again, leaving behind a parking lot that still trembled slightly from the wind. Dust and sand slowly settled. The sound of the rotors faded, dissolving into the pale blue phoenix sky. But the silence did not return. Phones remained raised, eyes continued to follow, and Daniel Miller stood in the middle of it all, like a man pulled out of the shadows and thrust under blinding lights. He turned to leave. "Wait!" a voice called from behind. A young man stood there, phone in hand, the screen still recording. "You just said, you're a Navy pilot?" Dan didn't answer. He walked faster. Another voice cut in. "The officer just called you Ghost 6, didn't she?" "Who is Ghost 6? "I found it!" someone shouted. "It's the call sign of a pilot from Operation Black Tide." Dan stopped, not out of curiosity, out of exhaustion. He turned back, looking at the crowd, strangers piecing together fragments of a life he had tried to bury. "I'm just a father," he said slowly. "And I need to go home." No one stopped him, but no one looked away. Minutes later, a short video appeared online, unedited, no background music, just wind, helicopter blades, and a middle-aged man pointing at military data as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. The headline spread at breakneck speed. "Fired auto mechanic turns out to be a U.S. Navy hero." At Hayes Automotive Headquarters, Rebecca Hayes sat in front of her computer screen. She wasn't accustomed to scrolling through social media during work hours, but this time her phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Messages, emails, missed calls. She opened the video. Rebecca recognized Dan immediately, not by the work coveralls, not by the tired face, but by the way he stood, the way he focused. He read the data as if he had been born to do it. She replayed the footage of him using the out-of-procedure testing method in the garage. This time, she saw it in a different light. Every movement is precise. Every step is purposeful. Rebecca opened her laptop and quickly typed a few key words. Military field diagnostic techniques, rapid pressure testing under combat conditions. The results made her hands freeze. Accuracy, 98%. Processing time, 40% faster than standard procedures. Rebecca leaned back in her chair. She had fired him for being better. Across the city, Dan sat in his car, hands resting on the steering wheel, the engine still off. He looked into the rearview mirror as the pharmacy shrank into the distance. His phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. "Daniel Miller, this is Admiral Harris. We need to talk." Dan closed his eyes. Old images surged back, painfully vivid. Stormy nights, black seas, red warning lights, shouting in his headset. The smell of smoke, the stench of burning metal. 14 survived, 3 did not. He remembered every face. He remembered even the names the world never knew. Dan started the car and drove home. When he opened the door, Lily came running out. Dad, I saw you on the pharmacist's phone." She looked up at him, eyes sparkling. "Are you a hero?" Dan knelt in front of her, placing his hands on her small shoulders. No, sweetheart. His voice softened. I just did what needed to be done. Lily tilted her head. But she said you saved people. Dan pulled her into a tight embrace. He whispered almost to himself, there are fathers who couldn't be saved. Outside, the evening light settled over the city. Dan's phone buzzed again. This time he knew, whether he wanted it or not. The story of Ghost 6 had stepped out of the shadows, and he would have to face it once more. The next morning, Dan took Lily to school earlier than usual. She still coughed lightly when she ran, but her smile never changed. Before stepping through the gate, Lily turned back and waved. Dad, don't forget to read me a story tonight. Dan nodded. I promise. He stood there for a few more seconds, watching her blend into the group of laughing children. Only when Lily disappeared behind the classroom door did Dan turn away. The phone in his pocket vibrated, the third time that morning. He didn't need to look to know who it was. The meeting was arranged quickly, no ceremony, no formalities, just a small conference room at a temporary Navy headquarters on the outskirts of the city. When Dan walked in, he immediately recognized faces that had once been part of his life, even though time had changed them. At the head of the table, a gray-haired man stood up. His shoulders were heavy with medals, his gaze calm but not distant. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Miller, he said slowly. Or should we call you Ghost 6? Dan remained still. That name is dead, sir. The man smiled faintly. But what you did is not. He gestured for Dan to sit. The screen behind them lit up. A satellite map appeared. Dark blue waters, tangled lines, faint points barely visible to the naked eye. Pilot Marcus Webb, 34 years old, missing for 48 hours, the Admiral said. You're the only one who saw the signal we missed. Dan looked at the screen. His hand rested on the edge of the table, fingers tightening slightly. That doesn't mean I can save him. The room fell silent. You have before, the Admiral replied. In storms, under fire, with a damaged helicopter. Dan let out a short laugh, not amused, not bitter, just tired. I saved 14 people, he said, his voice hoarse. And I lost 3. No one interrupted. You call that a success? Dan continued. I call it 3 names I'll never forget. He stood up, turning his back to the screen. I walked away because I couldn't keep counting. The Admiral stood as well. He stepped closer, close enough that Dan couldn't avoid his gaze. You walked away because you're a father, he said. Not because you're weak, but because you found something bigger than yourself. Dan turned back. My daughter needs me, he said, almost a whisper. She needs me alive. And Marcus Webb's daughter does too, the Admiral replied. The words landed in the room like a heavy weight. Dan closed his eyes. In his mind, the image of Lily sitting at the dinner table appeared, her inhaler placed neatly beside her. Then another image, another child somewhere else, waiting for a father who hadn't come home. He opened his eyes. Show me all the data, Dan said. There was no applause, no praise, just a quiet wave of relief moving through the room. 3 hours later, Dan stood before the screen, his hands moving quickly and decisively. Numbers, signal lines, and details others overlooked told an obvious story to him. Here, he said, pointing to a dark area on the map. Coral reefs create a radar shadow. Titanium airframe masked. He made an emergency landing. The young officer frowned. We scanned this area. Dan shook his head. You scanned with your eyes. I'm listening with memory. The Admiral picked up a radio. "Prepare the rescue team." Dan stepped back, exhaling slowly. He didn't feel relieved. He just felt right. When the meeting ended, Dan stood alone in the hallway. His phone buzzed. A message from Lily. "Dad, I didn't cough much today. My teacher said I was very good." Dan smiled. He typed back, "I'm proud of you." He looked up through the glass window. The sky was clear, peacefully so. For the first time in years, Dan didn't turn away when he heard a helicopter pass overhead. He stood still. Not because the past was pulling him back, but because the present was finally strong enough for him to face it. Rebecca Hayes sat alone in the top-floor office of Hayes Automotive Headquarters. The city of Phoenix stretched out beneath the large glass windows, flooded with sunlight, the kind of light she had always believed to be a symbol of success. Today, it made her feel empty. The computer screen in front of her was frozen on a familiar frame. Daniel Miller standing in the pharmacy parking lot, helicopter rotor wash whipping his jacket, his eyes locked onto radar data as if it were his native language. Rebecca had watched the video at least 10 times. Each time she replayed it, a new detail became clearer. The way Dan positioned his hands, the way he tilted his head, the way he said, "The pilot is alive," with absolute certainty. Not the confidence of someone seeking recognition, but the calm of someone long accustomed to having human lives depend on his decisions. She rewound to the footage from the garage. The moment she stood in front of Dan. The moment she said, "You're fired," effective immediately. Rebecca closed her eyes. At the time, she had thought she was demonstrating strength. Now she realized it had only been fear disguised as authority. The phone on her desk vibrated, a call from the chairman of the board. "Rebecca, do you understand what this is doing to the company?" His voice wasn't angry, it was more dangerous than that, cold and tired. "That video has passed 2 million views. The press is calling us the company that fired a hero." Rebecca took a deep breath. "Sir, I was wrong." On the other end of the line, there was a rare pause. "You fired a decorated former Navy pilot," he continued, "in front of employees, simply because he didn't follow the manual. Do you understand what that says about us?" Rebecca opened a file folder on her desk. It had just been delivered from the Navy, stamped classified. Thick pages detailed each mission, each report, each name. Operation Black Tide. 14 survivors, 3 fallen. She flipped to the final page. A photograph. Dan, much younger, in a flight suit, eyes hardened but not cold. The eyes of someone who had seen too much. "I didn't see that person," Rebecca said quietly. "I only saw a risk." "So what are you going to do?" the chairman asked. Rebecca didn't answer right away. She looked back at the screen, where Dan was speaking with Navy officers. Then she looked out the window, where the cars moving in and out of the garage below seemed small and fragile. "I'm going to make it right," she said, her voice steadier. "Not for PR, but because it's right." The call ended. Rebecca sat motionless for a long time. She remembered that morning in the garage, remembered Dan's eyes when he mentioned his daughter, remembered the way he lowered his head, no argument, no resistance, not out of weakness, but because he was used to putting others before himself. Rebecca stood up and put on her coat. She didn't call her assistant. She didn't announce anything. She simply took her car keys and left the office. The car came to a stop in front of an old apartment complex. No sign, no security, nothing to suggest this was the home of a hero. Rebecca stood before the apartment door, her hand lifting, then falling back down. For the first time in years, she hesitated, not out of fear of failure, but out of fear of hurting someone else again. Finally, she knocked. The door opened. Dan stood there, the same face, but with more caution in his eyes. "Ms. Hayes." Rebecca swallowed. "Daniel, may I come in?" Dan hesitated for a second, then opened the door wider. Inside the small apartment, Rebecca saw things she had never seen in the garage. Medical bills stacked neatly on the table, a nearly empty refrigerator, and a little girl sitting on the floor playing with a small metal coin. Lily looked up. "Dad, who is this lady?" Rebecca knelt to the child's eye level. "My name is Rebecca. I work with your dad." Lily smiled. "My dad is a hero." Rebecca felt her throat tighten. She turned to Dan, her voice breaking. "I didn't see you, and that is my fault." Dan remained silent. That silence didn't accuse her. It simply forced her to face herself. And Rebecca understood. From this moment on, there was no turning back. The 12th floor boardroom of Hayes Automotive was more crowded than usual that morning. The long, polished wooden table reflected the cold white overhead lights. 8 board members sat along both sides, most of them older than Rebecca Hayes, their expressions a mixture of skepticism and fatigue. The air was heavy. Rebecca stood at the head of the table. No tablet, no presentation slides. In front of her lay only a thin folder, the same folder she had carried with her when she left Dan's small apartment the night before. The chairman tapped the gavel lightly. "Let's begin." One board member spoke first, his irritation barely concealed. "Rebecca, do you understand the situation? Our stock is down. Contracts are being delayed. The media is calling us ungrateful." Another added, "You fired a mechanic, then discovered he was a Navy hero. Right or wrong, the company's image has taken a hit." Rebecca listened without interrupting. When the room fell quiet, she took a deep breath. "I didn't call this meeting to defend myself," she said, her voice calmer than she expected. "I called this meeting to correct a mistake." Several heads lifted. Rebecca opened the folder and placed each page on the table, sliding them toward the center. "Daniel Miller is not just an employee," she continued. "He is someone who saved 14 lives in an operation many of you know only through reports." One member scoffed softly. "We're talking about a military past. That has nothing to do with performance in a garage." Rebecca turned to him. "Sir, that very past is what allowed him to detect a technical failure our procedures missed." She pressed a control. 2 numbers appeared on the large screen. 98%, military field methodology. 73%, current standard procedure. The room stirred. "I fired him because he didn't follow the manual," Rebecca went on. "The truth is, he was outperforming the manual." The chairman leaned back in his chair. "So, what is your proposal?" Rebecca didn't hesitate. "I propose reinstating Daniel Miller," she paused, "and appointing him Director of Technical Operations." A loud murmur erupted. "Impossible. He has no management degree. This sets a dangerous precedent." Rebecca straightened, both hands resting firmly on the table. "The dangerous precedent is firing capable people simply because they are different." Her voice hardened. "The dangerous precedent is allowing fear to drive decisions." A man seated at the far end of the table, silent until now, spoke up. He was the newest board member, a retired general. "I know Operation Black Tide," he said slowly. "I know the call sign, Ghost 6. Every head turned toward him. "If the man you're referring to is Daniel Miller," he continued, "then we don't just owe him an apology. We owe him respect." He looked around the table. "I vote yes." Silence stretched for several seconds. Then, One by one, hands rose, slowly, but decisively. Finally, the chairman nodded. Very well, but there's one condition. He looked at Rebecca. He has to accept. That afternoon, Rebecca went to Lily's elementary school. She stood outside the gate, watching Dan kneel to tie his daughter's shoelaces. A father. No uniform. No insignia. When Dan saw her, his body tensed slightly. If you're here for the media... No. Rebecca handed him an envelope. I'm here for you. Dan opened it, read. His expression shifted from suspicion to shock. Director? He shook his head. You've made a mistake. Rebecca stepped closer. You haven't. You've just forgotten who you are. Dan looked through the classroom window where Lily was laughing with her classmates. I'm not doing this for recognition, he said quietly. Rebecca nodded. I know. And that's exactly why we need you. Dan remained silent for a long moment. Then he exhaled. For my daughter. Rebecca smiled. For what matters most. In that moment, there was no CEO, no board of directors, only two people, choosing what was right, late, but genuine. 3 weeks later, mornings at Hayes Automotive carried a different rhythm. Not louder, not faster, just calmer. Daniel Miller walked into the garage wearing a light blue shirt, sleeves neatly rolled up. He was still wearing the same familiar old shoes, but his steps were no longer rushed. On his chest, a new name badge reflected the overhead lights. Director of Technical Operations. Dan was still not accustomed to the title. He paused at the edge of the shop floor where cars lined up waiting for inspection. The smell of oil was still there. The machines still hummed. But the way people looked at him had changed. No more wary glances, no more awkward silence. They nodded in greeting. A few smiled. Dan returned the gesture with a slight nod. No showmanship, no air of authority. He simply walked over to a vehicle, listened for a few seconds, then said, That sound isn't right. Check the rear axle. The young mechanic followed the instructions. 10 minutes later, the problem revealed itself. No one asked how Dan knew. They simply remembered that he was right. In the technical meeting room, Dan sat with engineers and mechanics alike. He didn't stand at the board. He didn't speak much. He listened. When someone suggested a different approach, he didn't dismiss it. Try it, he said. If it's safer and more efficient, it's worth trying. Gradually, people began to speak up more, no longer afraid of being wrong, no longer afraid of judgment. The culture of the shop changed, not through commands, but through trust. Upstairs, Rebecca Hayes stood behind the glass, quietly observing. She saw something she had never created before, a workplace where people felt respected. She didn't interfere. She learned to step back. That afternoon, Dan left work early, not because there was nothing left to do, but because there was somewhere he needed to be. Lily was waiting for him at the company daycare. She ran toward him and wrapped her arms around him. In her hand was a new, clean, organized, and fully stocked inhaler. Dad, the nurse said I did really well today. Dan bent down and ruffled her hair. I think so too. On the drive home, Lily sat in the back seat, legs swinging, telling him all kinds of small stories from school. Dan listened to every word as if it were the most essential thing in the world. And to him, it was. That evening, Dan sat at the kitchen table, not counting money. The medical bills were still there, but they no longer haunted him. He placed Lily's medication neatly into the cabinet, organized and complete. Lily looked up at him. Dad, do you still have to work so many shifts now? Dan smiled. No, I get to be home more. Lily thought for a moment, then said, I like it when you're home. Dan turned slightly away, hiding the emotion rising in his chest. I do too. Night fell. The city grew quiet. Dan stood on the small balcony looking up at the dark sky. A helicopter passed in the distance, its lights blinking. This time, he didn't tense up. He didn't turn away. He simply watched and let it pass. Rebecca knocked on his office door the next morning. Do you have a minute? Dan nodded. The company is recovering, she said. But more importantly, people are changing. Dan looked out over the shop floor. People just need to be listened to. Rebecca smiled. You taught me that. Dan shook his head. I only did what I learned from loss. Rebecca fell silent. She understood. Below, Lily was playing in the daycare, her laughter echoing through the open space. Dan looked at her, his expression softening. At last, he understood. He didn't need to forget the past to move forward. He only needed a reason strong enough to live with it. And for Daniel Miller, that reason was laughing, breathing steadily, and waiting for him to come home every day. Some afternoons do not arrive with the sound of victory trumpets. No stage lights, no applause. They arrive quietly. On one such afternoon, Daniel Miller stood by the window of his new office, looking down at the shop floor as the machines gradually powered down. Workers put away their tools. The chatter softened. Another workday ended. No incidents, no crises, no one left behind. Dan realized that for a very long time he had been used to living in moments balanced between life and death, places where every decision carried irreversible consequences, places where mistakes were not allowed. But life now was different. It no longer asked him to save anyone from the night sky. It only asked him to be present. Dan left the office earlier than usual. He passed by the company daycare. Lily was sitting on the floor building blocks with a few other children. When she saw him, she jumped up and ran over, wrapping her arms around him as if afraid he might disappear. Dad, today I built a whole city. Dan crouched down to look at the colorful plastic city, a chaotic yet imaginative creation. It's beautiful, he said, and this time, he truly meant it. On the drive home, Lily rested her head against the back seat, her eyes slowly closing. Her breathing was steady, safe. Dan glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his heart softening with every mile. He used to think that to be a hero, one had to fight, to sacrifice, to lose. No one ever told him that continuing to live as an ordinary human being after all of that also required just as much courage. Some wounds leave no scars on the skin. They lie deeper, in memory, in names we can never call again. Dan still remembered them. He knew he always would. But now, when those memories surfaced, he no longer let them drown him. He let them remind him why he was still here. Why had he chosen to walk away? And why he remained standing? Elsewhere in the city, Rebecca Hayes turned off the lights in her office and stood alone in the darkness for a few seconds. She had once believed leadership meant control, never being wrong, being strong at any cost. But some lessons only arrive when we are brave enough to admit we were wrong. She learned that power does not lie in removing others, but in lifting them. That discipline does not require the absence of compassion. And sometimes, the strongest thing a person can do is apologize. Life goes on. Not perfect, not easy, but more honest. Dan doesn't need to be called a hero. He doesn't need medals. He doesn't need admiring looks from strangers. He only needs to know that every night, A child is waiting for him to come home. And every morning, he wakes up with a reason big enough to keep going. Perhaps that is the simplest definition of honor. Honor does not demand recognition. It reveals itself in how we treat others, especially when we have the power to hurt them. We often look at titles, uniforms, wealth, status, and stop there. But behind every ordinary face, there may be an extraordinary story. A father fighting for his child, a veteran carrying invisible scars, or a person trying to live with decency in a world that is not always kind to them. Daniel Miller does not need a title to be a hero. He is a hero when he wears oil-stained coveralls, when he counts every dollar at the pharmacy, and when he chooses love over glory. If this story made you slow down for a moment, made you look at an ordinary person a little longer, or made you believe that quiet kindness still has a place in this world, then that is precisely why Deep Life Tales exists. For instance, if you believe that true strength does not need to be loud, share this story with someone you cherish. Comment, what moment stayed with you the most? And subscribe to Deep Life Tales as we continue telling stories about people where honor never fades and compassion always finds its way home.